I went down to toss out the trash and caught my mother-in-law secretly slipping a white powder into my food. Keeping my composure, I quietly had the meal delivered to my husband for his late-night dinner instead. At 3:00 a.m., my phone buzzed. An ER physician called to inform me my husband was in critical condition. When I arrived at the hospital, my mother-in-law fainted on the cold tile floor at the sight of two gurneys. At 1:30 a.m., the corridor of the vintage brick walk-up building in Chicago where I lived sank into an eerie, suffocating silence. Only the biting winter wind howled through the cracked window pane at the end of the hallway, emitting a sound like a mournful wail. My name is Tamsin Vance, and I am a clinical pharmacist. My daily life revolves around prescriptions, precise dosages that decide human fates, and the sharp, acrid scent of antiseptic embedded into every fiber of my white lab coat. Tonight, a sharp pang of hunger from a skipped dinner forced me to order a piping hot container of chicken noodle soup via DoorDash. I had no idea that this single container of soup would ignite a brutal tragedy within my family. Carrying the brown paper bag to my door, I was about to slide my key into the deadbolt when my gaze chanced upon the decorative mirror hanging above the entryway console table. It was a gilded accent piece my husband, Dorian, had bought under the pretense of checking his tie before greeting guests. In its dim, dusty reflection, I saw the bedroom door creak open. A shadow slunk out like a thief in the night. It was Vivienne Vance, my mother-in-law. She was wearing a plum-colored silk kimono robe. Her hand clutched a small plastic baggie, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door as if checking whether I had returned. I held my breath, shrinking into the dark recess near the hallway closet, pretending to rummage through my tote bag for dropped keys while I watched her every move. Vivienne crept over to the dining table where the DoorDash driver had just set my order. With trembling hands, she popped the lid off the soup container and poured a fine, white powder into the steaming broth. Her lips whispered venomous curses that, despite the distance, carried crisply through the midnight silence. "Eat it and rot already, you sterile leech. Stop taking up space meant for my grandson." She stirred the soup lightly with a spoon, clumsily wiped away a spill of powder along the plastic rim with a paper napkin, and scurried back into the bedroom, closing the door tight. My heart felt as if it were caught in a vice, not from fear, but from a wave of pure bitterness rising in my throat. I waited until I heard the bedroom latch click before I dared to straighten up. Stepping into the apartment, the comforting aroma of chicken broth filled the air. But tonight, it smelled repulsive. Beneath the savory herbs lay a sharp, chemical undertone. With my heightened olfactory senses honed by 10 years as a pharmacist working with raw compounds, I identified it instantly. It wasn't rat poison or arsenic. It was the distinct, pungent scent of a crushed, new-generation antibiotic from the cephalosporin class. A icy chill ran down my spine as I pieced the facts together. Just that afternoon, Vivienne had persuaded me to sign paperwork for a substantial supplemental life insurance policy. The designated beneficiary was her. She hadn't chosen a violent poison. Terrified that law enforcement or a toxicology screen would trace it back to her, she picked an antibiotic, assuming it would merely cause me an unexplained illness, severe weakness, or a miscarriage if I happened to be pregnant. Then I remembered the text message Dorian had sent me at 7:00 p.m. "Babe, emergency meeting with the VP. Closing the end-of-year deal, probably pulling an all-nighter at the office. Don't wait up." I knew exactly what his emergency meetings meant. The Find My app on the brand-new iPhone I had bought him last month showed his location pulsing at a luxury high-rise condominium in River North, a building he frequented. And Dorian had a routine. Whenever he met with clients or entertained his side interests, he drank heavily. He struggled with functional alcoholism, often downing excessive amounts of hard liquor to project a bravado he didn't possess. As a clinical pharmacist, I knew better than anyone what happens when a high dose of cephalosporin collides with alcohol in the human body. It inhibits the enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase, blocking the metabolism of ethanol and causing a massive accumulation of acetaldehyde, a compound dozens of times more toxic than alcohol itself. It triggers severe disulfiram-like reactions, catastrophic blood pressure drops, acute cardiovascular collapse, and rapid death. My mother-in-law intended to poison her daughter-in-law, but in her ignorance, she had placed a sharp blade against her own son's throat. I stood frozen in the middle of the cold kitchen, staring down at the container of broth my mother-in-law had so generously seasoned. A fierce internal battle raged within me between my oath as a medical professional and the searing rage of a betrayed wife. Finally, my fingers glided across my phone screen. I dialed the DoorDash driver's number. "Hi, excuse me. Could you possibly come back up for a moment? I'll add a generous tip in the app. I need this meal delivered to a different address immediately." Handing the bag back to the driver, I typed a text to Dorian, keeping my tone perfectly sweet. "Sweetheart, you're working so hard. Your mom saw you were out late and worried you'd be hungry. She insisted I send over this hot soup she prepared for you. Eat up to stay warm and sober up. Don't let her effort go to waste." After hitting send, I sat on the leather couch and stared into the dark. The shadows in the apartment felt like silent co-conspirators. I hadn't poisoned anyone. I was merely a caring wife forwarding a meal at my mother-in-law's behest. What was inside that soup, and who put it there? Heaven was watching. I lay in bed, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. The ticking clock marked the seconds like a countdown. 3:00 a.m. The silence was so profound I could hear my own shallow breathing. Memories of the past 3 years flooded my mind. Vivienne's relentless verbal abuse. She had called me a barren tree, a useless woman responsible for ending the Vance family line. She had forced me to drink bizarre herbal concoctions and unverified tinctures that left my stomach inflamed and my body exhausted. I had endured it all, swallowing my pride, thinking I was somehow failing in my duties as a wife. But tonight, her cruelty had shattered the last boundary of human decency. At exactly 3:05 a.m., my phone shrieked, shattering the quiet. The caller ID displayed the name of the night shift ER attending physician at Northwestern Memorial. My heart skipped a beat. Even though I was expecting it, my hands shook violently as I swiped to answer. "Tamsin, you need to get to the ER right now." My colleague's voice rose in a frantic rush. "It's Dorian. He was brought in via ambulance in critical condition. Full cardiac and respiratory arrest." I let the phone slip onto the mattress, putting on the performance of a wife who had just received devastating news. But deep inside, I knew the script was unfolding precisely as written. I threw on a heavy coat and drove through the freezing Chicago night. The icy wind lashed against my windshield, forcing tears down my cheeks, whether from the chill or from grieving the final tragic death of my marriage. I couldn't tell. When I arrived, the emergency department corridor was a blur of chaos, rushing footsteps, and the heavy smell of medical disinfectant. That familiar smell felt darker tonight. Vivienne was already there. The hospital had called the last dialed number on Dorian's phone. She was crumpled on the cold tile floor, weeping hysterically. The moment she spotted me, she lunged forward, clawing at the air toward my hair. But 2 hospital security guards restrained her. "It was you! You killed my son!" she screeched, her voice echoing off the walls. "Why didn't you eat the soup? Why did Dorian eat it?" The attending physician stepped out, nodding with a tired, sympathetic expression. He looked at me with deep pity. "Tamsin, we did everything we could." But the patient suffered a severe disulfiram-like toxic reaction compound by an extremely high blood alcohol concentration. The reaction was lightning fast, causing irreversible cardiovascular collapse. He passed away at 3:00 a.m. Hearing the official pronouncement of her son's death, Vivienne choked on her own screams, her eyes rolling back. But the real shock was yet to come. The physician hesitated slightly, then added, "And the young woman who was admitted alongside Dorian, Selena. She was roughly 3 months pregnant. Her system was far more fragile. She had also consumed the soup alongside wine. Neither the mother nor the fetus survived. One incident, 2 fatalities. One incident, 2 fatalities." The words struck Vivienne like a physical blow. She froze instantly, turning as pale as stone. She knew exactly who Selena was. Selena was the young mistress whose affair with Dorian Vivienne had secretly encouraged the woman carrying the long-awaited grandson meant to replace me. Vivienne stared blankly as 2 gurneys were wheeled out of the resuscitation bay, covered in cold white sheets. One large, one small. With her own hands, Vivienne had laced that soup with drugs to murder me, clearing the path for the mistress and the grandchild to take over the Vance estate. But in a twisted stroke of fate, that very container of soup had sent her son, her mistress-in-law, and her unborn grandchild to the morgue. Vivienne swayed, clutched her chest, her lips moving soundlessly, and collapsed flat onto the floor, unconscious. I stood leaning against the wall, watching the chaos unfold. Tears continued to stream down my face, completing my role as the grief-stricken widow, but inside, there was only a ringing, hollow void. The air inside the police interrogation room was thick with 20 Danges Dane, the stale scent of cold coffee and tense silence. I sat opposite two detectives, my fingers wrapped around a paper cup of warm water provided by a young officer. I forced myself not to shiver, not from fear, but from a bone-deep coldness. Vivienne had regained consciousness at the hospital, but her first words were not a lament for her son. They were a wild, venomous accusation against me. She claimed I had poisoned the soup, framing me as a cold-blooded killer desperate to get rid of my husband for his estate. Detective Marcus Croft, a veteran investigator whose weathered face suggested he had seen every shade of domestic malice, studied me with a piercing gaze. "Mrs. Vance, your mother-in-law explicitly states that you received the food delivery and brought it into the residence. She claims you and your husband had severe financial disputes and infidelity issues. She believes you took a drastic step." I raised my bloodshot eyes to meet his, my voice raspy but steady. "Detective, yes, I accepted the food delivery. But I am a clinical pharmacist. I understand the precise mechanics of life and death better than most. If I wanted to harm my husband, I could think of 100 undetectable ways to do it. I certainly wouldn't order food through my own DoorDash account and then text him to eat it." I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone. My hands trembled slightly, but my movements were deliberate. I opened the app for the Ring indoor security camera Dorian had installed near our apartment entrance. He had set it up under the guise of home security while traveling, but I knew his true motive was surveillance tracking when I came home, where I went, and who I spoke to. The supreme irony was that his tool of control was now my sole salvation from his mother's frame job. I slid the phone across the table to Detective Croft. "This is the cloud footage from yesterday at 1:35 a.m. Watch for yourself." The high-definition video played smoothly. On screen, I was seen bending down near the console, searching through my bag for my keys. The moment my back was turned, the bedroom door opened. Vivienne crept out in her plum silk robe, her face looking sinister in the dim hallway nightlight. She hastily opened the container, dumped in a packet of white powder, and stirred it with a spoon. The sensitive microphone captured her muffled audio perfectly. "Eat it and rot, you sterile leech. You don't deserve to be a wife in this house." The young female officer standing by the door let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Detective Croft's brow furrowed, his jaw hardening into iron. I locked the screen. Tears spilled over my eyelashes again. My mother-in-law hated me because I hadn't given her a grandchild. She constantly tried to force unverified herbal mixtures down my throat. But I loved my husband. He worked late, so I forwarded the food to him. How could I have possibly known she had crushed an enormous dose of prescription antibiotics into it? I trailed off, leaving the rest to their imagination, allowing them to fill in the narrative of a mother's horrific malice versus an innocent, attentive wife. From a legal standpoint, my act was one of care. I had no idea the food contained an additive. Nor did I have official confirmation he was drinking alcohol at that exact moment. I was legally and blamelessly clear. When I stepped out of the precinct interrogation room, I saw Vivienne. She sat on a wooden bench in handcuffs, her head bowed, guarded by 2 officers awaiting her transport to a holding facility. Seeing me, she snapped like a rabid animal, trying to surge forward despite her restraints. "It was you! You knew! You stayed silent and sent it to him on purpose. You devil!" she shrieked. I stopped, adjusted my coat collar, and looked directly into her bloodshot eyes. Leaning down, I whispered into her ear softly enough that only she could hear, but cold enough to freeze her blood. "You certainly know how to season a meal, Vivienne. 1 bowl of soup, and you wiped out the entire Vance lineage." Vivienne's eyes rolled back. She let out a choked, gurgling sound and went completely limp in the officer's arms. I turned and walked out into the crisp morning light, my posture straight, though my chest felt packed with cold ash. I returned to the empty apartment as the sun rose over the Salzin skyline. The morning chill draped over me the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut. This home had once been my sanctuary, a place where I cooked dinners and arranged fresh flowers. Now, it was a crime scene, an arena of family tragedy where bonds were butchered by greed and stupidity. I sat on the leather sofa Dorian loved and placed a sealed plastic evidence bag containing his personal effects onto the coffee table. Inside was his iPhone, Its screen cracked near the top corner, likely from when he dropped it during his final agony. The police had returned it after extracting the data they needed. Dorian was obsessively cautious. His phone was always secured with a 6-digit passcode, and he never let me near it, claiming it was a matter of healthy boundaries in marriage. He never suspected that the wife he dismissed as naive remembered the exact date he had gotten down on one knee in a candlelit steakhouse in Back Bay, the 18th of May, 2020. With cold fingers, I entered 051820. The lock icon clicked open. The lock screen wallpaper wasn't our wedding photo, the one he bragged about to colleagues, but a high-resolution ultrasound image of a 6-week embryo, circled in bright red marker. I let out a dry, bitter laugh as I scrolled through his messaging apps, packed with explicit, affectionate text to a contact pinned at the top. Love to. I wasn't surprised by the physical infidelity, but what caused my blood to run cold was a file hidden deep inside his password-protected notes app. The title was terse and chilling. Plan retirement. The password for the note was, ironically, my birthday. He had used my own birth date to lock away the blueprint for my murder. The file had been created 3 months ago. It outlined a cold, step-by-step strategy. Secure a supplemental, high-value accidental death policy. Beneficiaries. Mother and husband. Exploit wife's severe, documented allergy to mangoes. Gradually introduce dried organic mango powder into her daily protein smoothies to trigger severe anaphylaxis. Prepare an expired or emptied EpiPen autoinjector to swap into her purse, ensuring medical intervention fails before EMS arrives. I read through the bullet points, a cold sweat breaking out across my back. Every line hit like a jagged blade. The man I had shared a bed with for years was a sociopath hiding behind a refined, suburban facade. He had mapped out every detail, even adding a reminder. Execute after Nov 15th once the insurance contestability clause window narrows. He wanted me dead so he could collect $1 million payout, bring his pregnant mistress into my home, and build a lavish life on my grave. Man proposes, but fate disposes. His meticulous murder plot was demolished by the sheer impatience and malice of his own mother. Vivienne, blinded by her hatred for me, and desperate to clear the field for her grandson, had taken matters into her own hands, using a heavy dose of antibiotics instead of mango powder. And in a dark twist of cosmic justice, the victim became the very son she was trying to enrich. I set the phone down. A wave of profound nausea washed over me, not from the fear of death, but from absolute disgust at the rotten core hiding beneath my husband's charming exterior. Yesterday's soup was not just a boomerang for Vivienne. It was an unexpected execution for a man who had casually calculated his wife's murder. In the quiet room, I began to laugh. It was a dry, hollow sound echoing off the bare walls. I was laughing at my own naivety and at the brutal, poetic irony of life. By mid-morning, weak sunlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I hadn't slept or eaten. I sat at my laptop, systematically uncovering the financial reality of my late husband. With his unlocked phone providing two-factor authentication, accessing Dorian's banking portals, investment apps, and lines of credit was simple. The numbers on the screen painted a horrific story of deceit. To the outside world, Dorian cultivated the persona of a high-earning senior vice president of sales with a 6-figure income. But behind that polished veneer lay financial ruin. His primary checking account held less than $2,000. Conversely, his debt ledger read like a terrifying rap sheet: dozens of high-interest payday loan apps, personal lines of credit, and 3 maxed-out rewards credit cards. His total personal liability exceeded $300,000. All those tailored suits, the leased German luxury sedan, and the lavish dinners were funded entirely on a mountain of high-interest debt. What hurt most wasn't his lack of money, but where it had gone. I audited his transaction history over the past 2 years. Hundreds of Venmo and Zelle transfers were executed with clockwork regularity. The recipient was none other than Selena Thorne. There were smaller transfers for dresses and spa days, alongside massive wire transfers, tens of thousands of dollars tagged for house renovations for her parents and auto loan payoff for her brother. My hard-earned salary and the joint savings I had trustingly handed over to him for wealth management had been systematically siphoned off to fund another family's lifestyle. He had taken my sweat, my sacrifices, and my devotion as a wife to build a nest for his mistress. I paused at a $10,000 transfer from last month. The memo read, "Happy birthday, Mom T." It had been sent to Selena's mother. Yet for my own mother's birthday, Dorian had bought a cheap supermarket floral arrangement, complaining that his company was going through a rough patch. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the mouse. He hadn't just betrayed my heart. He had financially cannibalized me, leaving behind a mountain of debt while enriching his side family. I downloaded every bank statement, took clear screenshots of the debt notices and illicit transfers, and printed them into a thick, organized dossier. In the world of forensics, numbers don't lie. Follow the money, and you find the truth. Dorian's memorial service was held at a prominent funeral home in the suburbs. I organized it impeccably, not out of lingering affection, but to maintain public decorum and control the narrative before the curtain fell. Soft, somber organ music drifted through the chapel, accompanied by the heavy scent of lilies. A steady stream of acquaintances, corporate colleagues and neighbors filed past. Wearing a modest black dress, I stood near the casket, nodding gracefully to each attendee, portraying the grieving, dignified widow. As expected, the quiet was shattered around 10:00 a.m. A loud, boisterous group burst through the double doors of the chapel, disrupting the solemn atmosphere. Leading the pack was a middle-aged couple, dressed plainly but carrying themselves with aggressive hostility, flanked by several young men with heavy tattoos and scowling expressions. It was Selena's parents and her brothers. They hadn't come to pay respects. They had come to extract blood money. The middle-aged woman, catching sight of Dorian's framed portrait, let out an ear-splitting wail that drowned out the organ music. "Oh God, my baby girl. How could you be taken from us like this? Give me back my daughter. Give me back my grandchild." She marched down the center aisle, clutching a framed photo of a smiling Selena, and slammed it down onto the memorial table directly next to Dorian's picture. The brazen act stunned everyone in the room. The man beside her, Selena's father, thrust an accusing finger directly at my face and bellowed, "You're his wife, aren't you? Your bastard husband was screwing my daughter and he got her killed. 2 lives lost because of your family. You couldn't keep your husband happy, so he dragged my daughter down with him. What do you have to say for yourself?" Gasps rippled through the pews. Whispers exploded as guests stared at me like sharp needles. I stood my ground, watching these people turn a memorial service into a shakedown. I felt no fear, only intense revulsion at their audacity. They knew full well their daughter was an active participant in wrecking a marriage. Yet instead of shame, they were leveraging her death to stage an extortion attempt. I subtly signaled to the funeral home security guards to hold back for a moment, letting the drama play out. Encouraged by my silence, the woman threw herself onto the carpet, beating her chest. "Look at her! The wealthy wife drove my daughter to her death. Now that he's dead, she wants to keep all his assets and leave us with nothing. We need compensation. $500,000. Pay us $500,000 for our pain and suffering, or we will ruin you. $500,000. The figure rolled off her tongue so easily. It turned out the value of her daughter's life had a precise price tag. Everything was about cash. I glanced around the room and saw the lingering doubts in the eyes of Dorian's colleagues and our neighbors. They were starting to buy into the performance of the aggrieved, downtrodden, working-class family. I looked down at the father's face, flushed with greed, and then gave a small nod to my attorney, who was standing quietly near the back alcove. My attorney stepped forward, carrying the thick dossier I had compiled. He adjusted his glasses and spoke in a calm, projecting tone that easily filled the chapel. "Excuse me. Before we discuss compensation, allow me to present the official financial audit of the deceased, Mr. Dorian Vance." He opened the folder. Every figure he read aloud sounded like a nail driven into Dorian's coffin, exposing the hollow reality of his life. According to verified bank statements and credit bureau reports, the attorney stated clearly, Dorian Vance owned 0 real estate. The vehicle he drove was on an active bank lease with defaulted payments. At the time of his passing, Mr. Vance carried $215,000 in credit card debt, alongside $85,000 in high-interest personal loans. A wave of shock swept through the room. Selena's parents froze, their mouths hanging open, their aggressive postures withered into pale, ash-like disbelief. They thought they had struck a gold mine. Instead, they had crashed into a financial abyss. I took 2 steps toward them, looking down at the trembling woman. And my attorney has one more item to read for you. The lawyer turned the page, his voice razor-sharp. During the course of his marriage, Mr. Taction and Petey, Vance unlawfully transferred a total of $154,000 from joint marital accounts directly to Selena Thorne and members of her immediate family. Under state property law, this constitutes a fraudulent conveyance of marital assets without spousal consent. My client, Tamsin Vance, has filed a civil claim to recover every cent of those funds from the recipient's estate and heirs. I looked Selena's father dead in the eye, the same man who had just screamed for $500,000. He was shaking, clutching the edge of a mahogany pew for support. "Did you hear that clearly?" I said, my voice echoing coldly through the chapel. Dorian wasn't rich. He was buried in debt. The money he used to repair your roof and pay off your son's truck was stolen from my paycheck. Now he's dead, but the legal debt remains. I don't owe you a single cent. In fact, your family owes my estate over $150,000. Silence descended on the hall, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. The truth had stripped away their victim masks. Selena's father tried to scramble for dignity, pointing a trembling finger at me. You can't scare us. My daughter is dead. You have no heart." "No heart?" I let out a bitter smile. "You brought a portrait of your daughter to a funeral to blackmail a widow. I've already filed a clawback lawsuit in county court. Summonses will be served to your residence by tomorrow morning. I will pursue that $150,000 plus legal fees to the full extent of the law, even if it means placing a lien on your home." At the mention of losing their home, Selena's mother broke into genuine, terrified wails. She tried to reach out to grab my hem, but I stepped back, avoiding her touch. "When your daughter chose to be a homewrecker, she should have understood that everything comes with a price," I said quietly. "Sometimes you pay with money. Sometimes with your life." I nodded to the security guards. They moved in swiftly, firmly escorting the loud, disgraced family toward the exit. Selena's father tried to mouth off, but under the disgusted glares of the funeral guests, he lowered his head, dragged his sobbing wife up, and slunk out the doors like a caught shoplifter. Dozens of guests held up their smartphones, recording the entire spectacle. By nightfall, the video of the Mistress's greedy family being evicted from the memorial service was trending across local social media. The next morning, before the memorial flowers had even wilted, I traded my morning clothes for a tailored dark suit and drove to the corporate headquarters of Dorian's employer. I wasn't there to weep or claim survivor benefits. I was there to execute the next phase of clearing the wreckage of my life. Sitting in a glass conference room opposite the VP of Human Resources and the Chief Legal Officer, I placed a flash drive containing the extracted data from Dorian's devices on the table. "I'm not here as a grieving widow today," I said calmly. "I'm here as a whistleblower. This drive contains immutable proof that my late husband and his associate, Selena Thorne, engaged in corporate fraud, kickback schemes, and embezzlement within your regional sales division." The legal officer frowned, plugging the drive into his laptop. Spreadsheets, internal messages, and altered invoices appeared on the presentation screen. Dorian had been inflating vendor contracts and receiving kickbacks, using Selena, who worked in corporate financial planning, to approve the fraudulent ledger entries. Their messaging logs were a mix of romantic notes and precise calculations on splitting illicit cash. "The total documented loss to your firm," I pointed to an Excel file, "is approximately $400,000. A vast portion was laundered directly into Selena Thorne's personal accounts. My husband is dead, but I refuse to let my name be tarnished by his corporate crimes. I request a formal internal audit, their immediate posthumous termination for cause, and the forfeiture of all unpaid bonuses or severance to offset your losses." The room fell dead silent. For a mid-cap corporate firm, compliance and reputational risk were everything. They could not afford a public scandal. The outcome was swift. The company terminated both Dorian and Selena posthumously for severe misconduct, revoking all life insurance add-ons and corporate death benefits. Furthermore, the company's legal team immediately filed an asset recovery suit against Selena's estate to claw back the embezzled corporate funds. Stepping out of the glass skyscraper into the chilly downtown air, I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of liberation. I had used the system to dismantle my enemies. Through the corporation's legal machine, I had delivered another fatal blow to Selena's greedy family, leaving them not only without their daughter's illicit income, but facing financial ruin from corporate lawyers. The moment I walked into the lobby of my apartment building, the front desk concierge called out to me, looking uncomfortable. He warned me that a group of people claiming to be my late husband's extended family was causing a disturbance outside my door upstairs. I smirked, thanked him, and took the elevator up. Word of Dorian's death and rumors that I was sitting on a massive insurance payout had traveled fast to his rural hometown, awakening the avarice of relatives who hadn't called us in years. Stepping off the elevator, I found Dorian's uncle, his father's older brother, alongside 2 aunts and a cousin, standing outside my door with duffel bags as if preparing to move in. "Well, look who finally showed up. Our precious niece-in-law," the uncle boomed, placing his hands on his hips. "Unlock the door. We're here to take inventory of Dorian's estate. He's gone, which means this place belongs to the Vance family lineage now. We won't let an outsider steal his legacy." "That's right," one of the aunts piped up. "We heard you're planning to sell the place. This apartment was bought with our nephew's hard work. You have no right to sell it. It needs to stay in the family." I leaned against the hallway wall, watching the circus. They were like vultures flocking to a carcass. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out a laminated property deed. "Take a close look, everyone. I bought and fully paid off this condo 2 years before I ever married Dorian. My name is the sole name on the deed. This is my separate, non-marital property. It is not part of Dorian's estate, and you have zero claim to it." The uncle's face flushed purple. "Nonsense! You were married, so what's his is yours, and what's yours is his. He put money into this place." I laughed softly, punching the code into my digital door lock. "He invested by building up $300,000 in credit card debt and wiring money to his mistress. And by the way, under state probate law, if an heir steps forward to claim a decedent's estate, they also assume full liability for the decedent's debts." I opened the door and gestured inward. "Dorian owes over $300,000 to collection agencies and banks. If you want to declare yourselves his rightful heirs, be my guest. I'll gladly transfer his debt files to your names today." The relatives blinked, stunned, but greed kept them anchored. The uncle spat on my doorstep. "Don't try to scare us with lawyer talk. Where's the proof? Even if he owes money, we're staying right here until things are settled." He pushed past me, and his wife and sister flopped onto my velvet sofa, kicking their dirty boots onto my coffee table, as if they owned the place. Looking at the dirt on my clean rug, my patience snapped. Without a word, I pulled out my phone and hit play on an audio recording app capturing their trespass. Then, I hit a speed dial button. Within 10 minutes, 2 uniformed Chicago police officers stepped out of the elevator I had alerted the front desk to call 911 the moment the relatives refused to leave. "Officers," I said calmly, handing over my property deed and ID. "These individuals have unlawfully entered my private residence, are refusing to leave, and are attempting to extort real property from me." Seeing the police, the uncle's bravado melted. "Wait, officers, we're family. We're just visiting our grieving niece." "Visits require the homeowner's consent," the lead officer said sternly. "You've been asked to leave. If you remain, you will be arrested for criminal trespass. ID's out." Now, my attorney, who had arrived right behind the police, added the final touch. "And just to be clear for probate court records, under Illinois compiled statutes, heirs who attempt to take possession of estate assets become personally liable for the decedent's creditors up to the value of the assets. We have $300,000 in collection notices ready for whichever one of you wants to sign as his representative." He slapped a thick stack of collection notices onto the table with a loud thud. At the mention of personal liability for $300,000, the aunts scrambled off the couch as if it were on fire. "Oh, we don't know anything about this. We're leaving. We have a train to catch." The uncle, dripping sweat, looked between the police officers and the debt papers. I was just checking on Tamsin, making sure she was all right." Within 2 minutes, the entire noisy horde tumbled out the door, practically tripping over each other to reach the elevator. The door slammed shut, returning the apartment to sweet, pristine silence. I thanked the officers, sat down on the floor, and began cleaning the dirt off my rug. I didn't cry, but my heart ached at how cheap family ties became the moment money entered the equation. I thought the drama would subside after routing the greedy relatives, but a digital storm was brewing. My phone vibrated relentlessly with notifications. A former colleague sent me a frantic text with a link to a live stream. Tamsin, look at this right now. That girl's family is destroying you online. They have tens of thousands of viewers. I clicked the link. On the screen was the swollen, tear-stained face of Selena's mother, sitting in a dimly lit living room with a framed photo of her daughter in the background. Please, good people, help us, she sobbed into the camera. My innocent daughter was taken from us. Yes, she made a mistake loving a married man. But does that deserve a death sentence? She was carrying my unborn grandchild. His wealthy wife knew the food was tainted, but she deliberately had it forwarded to my daughter and son-in-law. She used a delivery driver as a weapon to murder them both so she could keep all his money. Selena's father chimed in from the side. She has money and high-powered lawyers. Nobody listens to simple folks like us. Now she's suing us for money Dorian gave my daughter out of love. She wants to throw us onto the street. The tearful narrative, tailored for internet outrage, framed me as a heartless, wealthy villain. The comment section exploded. What a monster. The mistress made a mistake, but killing a pregnant woman? She used DoorDash to deliver a death sentence? Cold-blooded. Boycott her pharmacy. Cancel her. A cold wave washed over me, not from fear, but from horror at how easily public emotion could be weaponized. The mob didn't care about facts. They reacted to whoever cried loudest. I switched off the screen. Outside, the city lights sparkled, but inside me was absolute focus. The Vance family was corrupt. Dorian was a traitor. And now the internet wanted to drown me in lies. They picked the wrong target. The old Tamsin might have cowered and issued a tearful apology. The current Tamsin had walked through hellfire. I wasn't going to let extortionists play the victim on my grave. I sat at my desk, the cool blue light of the monitor reflecting off my face. Selena's family livestream had been running for over an hour, pulling in over 80,000 viewers. Friends called, begging me to turn off my comments or issue a statement. I gave everyone the same answer. Let the fire burn hotter. I didn't turn off comments. I didn't post a panicked defense. I allowed the public mob's rage to reach its absolute peak. In the age of social media, premature defense is weak. Silence is the blade you sharpen for a single fatal strike. When emotions peak, logic sleeps. That is the exact moment when cold, hard evidence cuts deepest. I took a sip of cold coffee, dialed Irving Hayes, an investigative journalist specializing in legal affairs whom I had retained earlier, and spoke softly. Irving, the temperature is right. Fire the first shot. Keep the headline explosive, but the article cold as ice. Just the facts. Don't worry, Irving chuckled on the line. It's loaded. At 8:00 p.m. sharp, the internet is going to spin upside down. At 8:00 p.m., a major investigative outlet published a featured article titled, "The Fatal Soup Delivery. Who is the Real Villain?" I immediately dropped the article link directly into the comment section of Selena's livestream, adding a simple caption. The truth is here. Read before you judge. Simultaneously, dozens of prominent true crime creators published the raw Ring camera footage from my entryway, the trump card I had held close to my chest. The internet exploded. But this time, the gale force winds shifted direction instantly. The crisp, unedited video left zero room for interpretation. Millions watched in horror as Vivian Vance crept down the hall, her face twisted in malice as she dumped white powder into the container. Her muffled voice captioned clearly across the screen. Eat it and rot, you sterile leech. No words could counter that visual. Public sentiment flipped 180 degrees within minutes. The very users who had been cursing me flooded back to attack Selena's stream. Holy hell! The mother-in-law tried to poison the wife and ended up killing her own son. The wife was innocent. The mother-in-law is a literal murderer. And the mistress's family knew she was messing with a married guy and stealing marital funds? Disgusting. While Selena's mother scrambled on screen, stammering excuses, I hit enter on my computer, releasing the second vault of evidence. High-resolution screenshots of Dorian's hidden plan retirement note and his text logs with Selena. The cold text lines were exposed to hundreds of thousands of readers. Dorian, November 15th. Insurance policy contestability window clears. Introduce mango allergen powder into smoothie. Swap EpiPen for dummy unit. Selena, babe, hurry up. I don't want our baby born while you're still tied to that barren woman. When do we get the payout? Dorian. Patience. Love. The dosage must look like accidental anaphylaxis. Once the $1M clears, we move to Europe. The innocent image of the naive young girl Selena's parents had tried to sell crumbled into dust. What remained was the face of a cold-blooded co-conspirator to attempted murder. By the next morning, Selena's parents didn't dare step outside their front door. Furthermore, the civil court granted an emergency asset freeze on their accounts based on the fraudulent conveyance filings. The landlord of their rented house served them an immediate eviction notice, refusing to be associated with the scandal. I sat in my car parked across the street, watching as Selena's parents dragged their battered suitcases to the curb while the landlord piled their belongings onto the sidewalk. Selena's mother sat on a cardboard box, weeping, but this time, no passers-by offered sympathy. People recognized their faces and walked past with looks of profound disgust. They tried calling relatives in their hometown, but news of their attempted murder plot had preceded them. No one answered their calls. Without money, without shelter, and cast out by society, they tasted absolute ruin. Their daughter died of greed, and they suffered social death because of theirs. I instructed my driver to pull away. Their punishment was complete. I was no saint bound to forgive those who plotted my death, but I was no demon either. I was simply a woman rebuilding her life from the ashes. A week later, my defense attorney brought disturbing news from the county jail. Vivienne was exhibiting severe mental distress, banging her head against the concrete walls, screaming incomprehensibly, and talking to herself. Her public defender had filed a motion for a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, attempting to establish an insanity defense or claim she was incompetent to stand trial due to acute psychosis. If the state evaluation deems her unfit or insane at the time of the offense, my lawyer warned, she won't go to a maximum security prison. She'll be remanded to a state psychiatric facility, where she could eventually seek conditional release if her condition stabilizes. My fists clenched. A woman who knew precisely which antibiotic to source, how to crush it, and when to slip it into my food was claiming insanity? It was a legal loophole. She killed her son, her unborn grandchild, and his mistress, and she tried to murder me. I could not let her escape justice under the guise of madness. Suddenly, an old memory from 3 years ago flashed in my mind. Dorian and I had visited a reproductive endocrinology clinic in downtown Chicago for fertility testing. Dorian had gone into the physician's office alone to retrieve his lab results. When he came out, he held my hand and solemnly told me that his testing was completely normal, that the fertility struggle lay entirely on my side. From that day on, I had carried an agonizing weight of guilt, enduring Vivienne's insults as damaged goods. What if? What if he had lied? The next morning, I drove directly to that fertility clinic. The medical director was a senior physician who had been a colleague of my late father. I explained the legal crisis, presented Dorian's death certificate, and requested his confidential archived fertility file under a formal legal subpoena. The physician looked at the records, let out a deep sigh, and looked at me with profound regret. Tamsin, I assumed Dorian was honest with you back then. Dorian had severe, congenital genetic azoospermia, a complete absence of motile sperm. His chances of fathering a child naturally were absolute zero. I sat frozen in my chair. For 3 years, I had been systematically gaslit. I had suffered immense emotional torment for a deficiency I never had. But more importantly, what this meant was breathtaking. The baby Selena was carrying the prized grandson, for whom Vivienne had destroyed my life and poisoned her own family, could not possibly be Dorian's. Dorian begged me not to disclose his diagnosis to you, the doctor added softly. His ego couldn't handle admitting male factor infertility. I let out a cold, sharp laugh. His fragile ego had cost me years of misery, but now, it would be his mother's final undoing. I requested a certified copy of Dorian's complete diagnostic file. Fortunately, the clinic's cryolab still possessed a reference tissue sample Dorian had deposited 3 years ago for diagnostic processing. Simultaneously, my attorney obtained a court order for a forensic DNA comparison using fetal tissue samples retained by the medical examiner's office. Those 2 genetic samples would become the iron door that locked Vivienne away forever. On the day of the competency hearing, heavy gray clouds hung over the Cook County Criminal Courthouse. I sat in the front row of the gallery. Vivienne's defense team felt confident. leaning heavily on her erratic behavior in custody. When guards led Vivienne in, I barely recognized her. The once domineering matriarch was hunched over, her hair white and unkempt, muttering gibberish and rocking back and forth. It was a masterclass in performance. Her attorney addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client suffered an acute psychotic break triggered by the sudden tragic loss of her son. She acted under severe delusional distress and lacks the mental capacity to comprehend her actions." He presented a stack of psychiatric preliminary reports. I watched silently as she put on her act. Then, the lead prosecutor, a sharp, uncompromising assistant state's attorney, stepped forward. "Your Honor, the state completely rejects the defense's assertion of insanity. We have definitive proof that the defendant's actions were calculated, premeditated, and driven by a specific, rational motive, not a psychotic delusion." The prosecutor walked toward the defense table. The defense claims she was delusional, yet video evidence shows her methodically preparing a chemical agent, selecting an opportunistic moment, and clearing physical evidence. More importantly, her motive was explicit. She repeatedly declared her intent to eliminate her daughter-in-law to secure a male heir for the Vance family line. The prosecutor paused, turning toward the gallery. "So where did this supposed heir come from?" The defense claims her mind was broken by grief over her son and grandson. But to prove her cold, calculating state of mind, the state presents a newly verified medical fact that completely shatters the foundation of her defense. Dorian's medical charts and the certified state police forensic DNA report appeared on the courtroom monitors. "DNA evidence, Your Honor." The prosecutor's voice resonated through the courtroom. The defendant justified her malice under the desperate delusion of preserving her family's bloodline. But tragically, that bloodline was an absolute illusion. Her son, Dorian Vance, suffered from confirmed, absolute genetic infertility. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Vivienne stopped rocking. Her muttering ceased. She snapped her head up, her eyes suddenly clear of fake confusion, staring at the screen in utter shock. The prosecutor zoomed in on the red underlined conclusion of the forensic report. Comparative DNA analysis. Tissue sample F882, fetus, displays a 0% probability of paternal lineage to reference sample V19, Dorian Vance. Paternity is definitively excluded. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Vivienne sat frozen, her mouth open, but no sound came out. The mask of insanity melted away, revealing the terrified face of a woman whose entire reality had just collapsed into dust. She had committed attempted murder and poisoned her own child for a grandchild that belonged to a complete stranger. Her son was not only infertile, but he had been cuckolded by his mistress. And she, the blind, arrogant mother, had become the instrument of her own son's execution for a lie. I stood up slowly from the gallery, looking directly into her eyes. "Take a good look, Vivienne." My voice carried clearly across the quiet room. "That's the truth Dorian hid from you for 3 years. He knew he was infertile. He knew that baby wasn't his. But he kept quiet so he could use you to help him steal my insurance money. You thought you were playing the protector of the family name, but you were just a fool. You murdered your only son for another man's child. No. No! You're lying! You're lying!" Vivienne shrieked, breaking into genuine, unscripted hysterics. "Dorian told me it was his. He showed me the ultrasound. My grandson! My blood!" She thrashed violently against her chair, slamming her hands against the wooden defense table, weeping real, agonizing tears of utter realization. Blood trickled from a scratch on her forehead, mixing with her tears. It was no longer an act. It was the agony of a soul realizing the full weight of its own senseless destruction. The bailiffs restrained her, injecting a sedative as the judge called for order. When court resumed, the judge, a stern woman with decades on the bench, delivered her ruling without hesitation. The actions of the defendant, Vivienne Vance, display extreme premeditation, cruelty, and malice. The court completely rejects the defense of mental irresponsibility. Her motive was rooted in greed, arrogance, and cold calculation. The judge looked down at the trembling woman. "By the authority of the state, this court sentences you, Vivienne Vance, to life imprisonment without parole." Life without parole. 2 words that sealed the fate of a woman who spent her life chasing a legacy, only to destroy everything she touched. A month later, I received permission for a final visitation at the state penitentiary before her transfer to a maximum security facility. I debated whether to go, but I needed to place the final stone on the grave of my past. Behind the thick bulletproof glass sat an emaciated old woman with hollow, vacant eyes. She picked up the phone with trembling fingers. "Where is my grandson?" She rasped into the receiver, her mind clinging to broken pieces of her denial. "Did you hide him?" Dorian said it was a boy. "Vivienne?" I said softly, my voice firm and clear. "There was no grandson. Wake up. Dorian lied to you, and you killed him for that lie." She dropped the phone handset, letting it dangle by its cord, and began clawing at her face, babbling incoherently. I hung up my receiver, turned my back, and walked out into the daylight. Upon returning to Chicago, my first act was to list the apartment for sale. I sold it quickly, below market value, wanting nothing from that cursed place. Packing only my clothes and my professional pharmacy reference texts, I left. I could not bring myself to keep the money from the sale or the funds recovered from Selena's family. I donated the vast majority, over $400,000, to a national shelter organization supporting victims of domestic abuse and coercive control. I rented a small, light-filled cottage in a quiet coastal town in Maine, returning to the true essence of my professional passion: chemistry and scent. The very olfactory talent that Dorian had mocked my hypersensitive sense of smell had saved my life by detecting the chemical additive in a bowl of soup. I converted a room in my cottage into a botanical laboratory, crafting bespoke, therapeutic, artisanal perfumes. I didn't create scents to entice men. I created them to bring peace and grounding to women healing from trauma. My debut fragrance collection was inspired by notes of winter pine, bitter orange, and crisp ocean air, transforming past bitterness into art. At the modest opening launch of my studio, I noticed a familiar figure among the guests. It was Detective Marcus Croft. He wasn't in uniform, but wore a simple linen shirt, holding a bouquet of white lilies. "Congratulations, Tamsin," he said warmly, handing me the flowers. "I bought one of your scents for my sister. She said it smells like resilience." We stood on the porch, looking out at the calm Atlantic waters. "Your case was the most complex I've handled in 20 years, Croft admitted quietly. "I knew you weren't naive, Tamsin. I had a feeling you let their own traps spring shut on them. But I kept my focus strictly on the physical evidence, because while the law requires facts, sometimes life demands justice. And you earned your freedom." His words settled deep in my chest. He had understood the unspoken truth all along. I didn't know what the future held, but it didn't matter anymore. Happiness was no longer about finding a man to rely on. It was the absolute confidence to stand firmly on my own 2 feet, dry my own tears, and build my own joy. I took a deep breath of the salt-laced sea air, smelling only clarity and quiet strength. My life, with all its heartbreaks and triumphs, finally belonged entirely to me.